Let's turn to the threat of instant destruction by nuclear weapons. The record on that is extremely interesting, and it demonstrates quite clearly that from the earliest days, the security of the population has been a non-issue and remains so to the present. The record is shocking and insufficiently recognized. I'd really urge you to look at it closely. It strongly supports the lament of the General Lee Butler. He's the last commander of the Strategic Air Command, which controls nuclear weapons and weapons policy. In his words, "We have so far survived the nuclear age by some combination of skill, luck, and divine intervention, and I suspect the latter in the greatest proportion." And he goes on to say that we can hardly count on divine intervention as we continue to play roulette with the fate of the species in pursuit of the driving factors in state policy. He didn't add that, I added it. So take a couple of illustrative examples, beginning at the start of the atomic age. At that time, this is 1950, the US was overwhelmingly powerful, enjoyed remarkable security, nothing like it in history, controlled the Western Hemisphere, controlled both oceans, controlled the opposite sides of both oceans, had 50% of the world's wealth. It was just incomparable power and security. There was, however, one potential threat, at that time. That was ICBMs with hydrogen bomb warheads. They didn't exist, but they might exist someday. There is actually a standard scholarly review of nuclear policies written with access to high-level documents. It's by McGeorge Bundy, who was the National Security Advisor for the Kennedy and Johnson administrations. And what he writes is that he describes the development of ICBMs with nuclear warheads as one of the great achievements of the Eisenhower administration, but he then adds that it's useful to recognize that both the United States and the Soviet Union might be in much less nuclear danger today if these missiles had never been developed. And he adds a very instructive comment. He says, "I am aware of no proposal, could find no proposal in the literature, either in or out of government, that these missiles should be banned by agreement." Nobody even considered it. There was no thought at all of trying to prevent the sole serious threat to the United States, threat of utter destruction. And this striking fact merits a phrase in the standard comprehensive history and has been ignored in commentary. I can't find anyone who's ever even referred to it. Well, could it have been prevented? Would a treaty have been possible? Can't be sure, of course, but there's some indication that it would have been possible. One suggestive indication is a remarkable proposal by Stalin in 1952. He offered to allow Germany to be unified with free elections, which of course the communists would lose, but with a condition that it not join a hostile military alliance. Again, hardly an extreme condition in the light of history. Well, Stalin's proposal was received in the United States, but it was ignored or, whenever mentioned, just ridiculed. Actually, recent scholarship, which now has access to Russian archives, has begun to take quite a different view, and an illuminating one. One case is Adam Ulam. He's a bitterly anti-communist Harvard scholar, leading specialist on Bolshevik Russia. Here's what he says. He says, "The status of Stalin's proposal is an unresolved mystery. Washington wasted little effort in flatly rejecting Moscow's initiative on grounds that were embarrassingly unconvincing, leaving open the basic question: was Stalin genuinely ready to sacrifice the GDR on the altar of real democracy, with consequences for world peace and real security that would have been enormous. One of the most prominent Cold War scholars, Melvin Leffler, reviewing recent research in Soviet archives, writes that scholars are surprised to discover that Lavrentiy Beria, the sinister, brutal head of the secret police, proposed that the Kremlin offer the West a deal on unification and neutralization of Germany, agreeing to sacrifice the East German communist regime to reduce East-West tensions and, of course, to improve political and economic conditions in Russia. Opportunities, he points out, that were squandered in favor of gaining West German participation in NATO. Well, under those circumstances, it's not at all impossible that agreements might have been reached that would have protected the security of the population from the gravest imaginable threat, total destruction. But the possibility was not considered. Another striking indication of how slight a role authentic security plays in state policy. Incidentally, this tells us quite a lot about intellectuals in the United States and Europe. Try to find any discussion of this. Well, that was revealed again in the years that followed. A couple of years later, Nikita Khrushchev took office. He recognized right away that Russia could not compete militarily with the United States, the richest, most powerful country in history. And he recognized that if Russia hoped to escape from its economic backwardness and, of course, the devastating effects of the Second World War, it would be necessary to reverse the arms race. So he proposed sharp reductions in offensive weapons, mutual reductions. The incoming Kennedy administration considered the offer and rejected it. Instead, they turned to rapid military expansion. The late Kenneth Waltz, one of the leading, most respected international relations scholars, describes it like this. He said, the Kennedy administration undertook the largest strategic and conventional peacetime military buildup the world has yet seen, as Khrushchev was trying to carry through a major reduction in conventional forces and to follow a strategy of minimum deterrence. And we did so, the U.S. did so, though the balance of strategic weapons greatly favored the United States. Again, a decision to harm national security, security of the population, while enhancing state power. That's Kennedy. A major reason why Kennedy barely squeaked to victory in 1960 was his charge that Eisenhower and Nixon had permitted the Russians to leap ahead in offensive weaponry, creating what they called a missile gap that severely threatened U.S. security. That frightened the population enough so that Kennedy barely won the election. In reality, the U.S. was far in the lead. The Russians had 4 operational ICBMs, tiny fraction of the U.S. arsenal. And this was quickly understood. And speaking for the administration, McGeorge Bundy again, he explained that they had nevertheless been right in emphasizing a fake missile gap because, as he put it, the phrase had a useful shorthand effect of calling attention to our basic military posture. That's an allusion to the posture of rapidly expanding, overwhelming U.S. dominance and threat, and rejecting security and the prospects for survival. Well, the Russians did react. The reaction was to place missiles in Cuba in October 1962. That move was motivated also by Kennedy's huge terrorist campaign against Cuba, which is mostly suppressed, but there's plenty of evidence about it, which was scheduled to lead to invasion in October 1962, the month when the missiles were emplaced. Now, that brought the world to the most dangerous moment in history, Kennedy advisor Arthur Schlesinger's phrase, historian. as the crisis peaked in late October, Kennedy received a secret letter from Khrushchev offering to end the crisis by simultaneous public withdrawal of Russian missiles from Cuba and U.S. Jupiter missiles from Turkey. These Jupiter missiles were obsolete missiles. The withdrawal order had already been given for them because they were being replaced by far more lethal, essentially invulnerable Polaris submarines. Kennedy's subjective estimate was that if he refused this offer, the probability of nuclear war was between 1/3 and 1/2, a war that would have destroyed the Northern Hemisphere, as President Eisenhower had stated. He refused. It's hard to think of a more horrendous decision in human history. And worse, he's praised for his cool courage and statesmanship. 10 years later, Henry Kissinger called a nuclear alert in the last days of the 1973 Israel-Arab War. The purpose was to warn the Russians not to interfere with his delicate diplomatic maneuvers. These were designed to ensure an Israeli victory, but a limited victory, so that the U.S. would still be in control of the region unilaterally. And the maneuvers were indeed delicate. The United States and Russia had jointly imposed a ceasefire, but Kissinger secretly informed Israel that they could ignore it, and therefore he called a nuclear alert to frighten the Russians away. The security of the population had its usual status, 0. 10 years after that, the Reagan administration came in, and they decided to launch operations to probe Russian defenses. The way they did it was by simulating air and naval attacks against Russia, and also calling the highest level nuclear alert, which is of course known to the Russians. All of this was undertaken at a very tense moment. Pershing II missiles were being deployed in Europe. These had a 5-minute flight time to Moscow. Reagan announced the so-called Star Wars program, missile defense, which the Russians understood to be a first strike weapon. That's how missile defense is understood on all sides for good reasons. And other tensions were rising. Well, naturally, the Russians were quite alarmed by this. Unlike the United States, Russia is quite vulnerable, had repeatedly been invaded, almost destroyed. That led to a major war scare in 1983. There are newly released archives that reveal that the danger was much more severe than historians had previously assumed. There's a CIA study that just appeared. It's called "The War Scare Was for Real." CIA concludes that the U.S. underestimated Russian concerns and the threat of a Russian reaction. The major journal on this topic, the Journal of Strategic Studies, writes that these Reagan exercises almost became a prelude to a preventive nuclear strike, which would have wiped out the Northern Hemisphere. And in fact, it was more dangerous than that. We learned last September, it was revealed that right in the midst of these world-threatening developments, Russia's automated early warning systems detected an incoming missile strike from the United States, sending the highest level alert. Well, the protocol for the Soviet military, like the American military, is to retaliate at once with a nuclear attack of its own. Now, there was an officer on duty, Stanislav Petrov. He decided to disobey the orders and not to report the warning to his superiors. And thanks to his dereliction of duty, we're alive to talk about it. That was 1983. You can determine how much publicity has been given to all of this. Well, security for the population was no more a priority for the Reagan planners than for their predecessors, and that continues right to the present. In fact, pretty obvious when you take a look at what's going on in Ukraine. And plans for the future are even more frightening. Obama came into office with nice rhetoric about cutting back the arms race. In fact, he's exceeding his predecessor, George Bush, in expanding the nuclear weapons arsenal. The United States under Obama is now planning to spend more than $1 trillion on the nuclear arsenal in the next 30 years. And of course, the United States is not alone, though it's in the lead. So going back to General Butler, it's a near miracle that we've escaped destruction so far, and the longer we tempt fate, the less likely it is that we can hope for divine intervention to rescue us from our folly. Well, we're all surely aware, just to conclude, that we now face the most ominous decisions in human history. There are lots of problems that should be addressed, but two of them are overwhelming in their significance: environmental destruction, nuclear war. For the first time in history, we face the prospects of destroying the possibility of decent existence, and not in the distant future. And for this reason alone, it's imperative to sweep away the ideological clouds, face honestly and realistically the question of how policy decisions are made and what we can do to alter them before it's too late.